Hello everyone, it's Andile Masuku of African Tech Roundup here. I'm really excited to be sharing the first installment of a two-part conversation I had with one of Zimbabwe's most well-known and perhaps most well-respected business people, the economist turned banker, entrepreneur and investor, Dr. Nigel Chanakira. Now, Dr. Nigel is probably most famous for founding Kingdom Financial Holdings Limited in 1997 and for orchestrating that company's much publicized merger and demerger with the Meikles Africa Group before later selling out to the Mauritius-based Afrasia Holdings. Now, you definitely want to listen in because this podcast offers fascinating insight into Dr. Nigel's personal and professional origin story. And this particular episode features an intriguing anecdote about the role he played in setting up a certain Strive Masiyiwa, the founder of Econet, to become one of Zimbabwe's most prolific entrepreneurial successes to date, and how simultaneously Dr. Nigel made what might be the poorest investment decision of his career. That's all next, but first I must tell you about an initiative we're backing at African Tech Roundup called Zimbabwe Investment Tour 2019. Now, ZIT 2019 is a carefully curated insight mission and transactional opportunity for discerning investors who view Africa as the next frontier for high-growth investment opportunities. Now, ZIT 2019 is set to take place in Zimbabwe's capital, Harare, in September 2019. And the event is set to attract serious regional and international investors who have a keen interest in sourcing actionable insight about Zimbabwe, making important high-level connections, and of course, most importantly, doing deals with investment-ready companies, asset managers, fund managers, and government authorities in the new Zimbabwe. Now, for the moment, this is just a heads up. More details about how you can be a part of the event will be revealed in the coming weeks and months. But in the meantime, you can head to ZimbabweInvestmentTours.com and subscribe for the newsletter so you don't miss a thing. And you can also follow Zimbabwe Investment Tours on Twitter at Investment Tours, on Facebook at facebook.com/Zimbabwe Investment Tours. And of course on LinkedIn, just search Zimbabwe Investment Tours and follow them there. And now, without any further ado, enjoy the episode.
My name is Nigel Chanakira. I guess of Kingdom fame. I am an entrepreneur. I am a success facilitator or success coach. I do private equity investments in Zimbabwe and Southern Africa. And I am fanatical about the prospects of Zimbabwe.
Welcome to the African Tech Roundup, Dr. Nigel Chanakira.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on your show.
The pleasure is certainly mine. Let's unpack that self-introduction a little bit. What do you think of yourself as first or foremost?
I think first and foremost, I am a motivator of people. I love motivating people to realize their God-given potential. I believe I have been very, very privileged in my life in the sense of being introduced into business early. My parents were pioneer businessmen. The first bus operator in Zimbabwe was actually an uncle of mine who's late, and he set up Modern Express buses, originally a lorry, which was converted into a bus. And so that whole pioneering and entrepreneurial spirit reigns very, very strongly within our family. So I'm a second generation entrepreneur. My dad was a grocer. He had shops in Harare and Mondoro area. And so we grew up, in a sense, behind the till. And so that status that comes with a businessman within a big family, or as the Chanakiras were, the status that my uncles and my dads earned within the family were so compelling to me that all I ever wanted to be was to be an entrepreneur and a businessman, in my own right. And having then become that as a banker, I set up and founded Kingdom at a very young age. I was 27 years old when we were awarded our bank license, which was unheard of. And so we...
Was that the first black-owned bank in Zimbabwe, or had some come before? I can't quite recall.
Yeah, we were not the first. Many think we were the first because we were the loudest, I guess, and with a young CEO that attracted a lot of following. But definitely Intermarket with Nick Vingirai and the late Gibson Muringai were the pioneers of banking in Zimbabwe as far as black banks were concerned. And then came NMB, Trust Bank, and NDH, and then Kingdom.
Are you serious? All those before you?
Absolutely, yeah. So, they were older, wiser. They saw the light and they had more capital than I had. And ours was a bit of a fairy tale story in the sense that I had no capital along with my partners. And I had to persuade my wife to sell our family home in Eastleigh so that we could have the startup capital for the bank. And as they say, the rest is history.
I believe the youngsters call that being a ride or die.
Yes, absolutely. It's betting the farm, essentially. But my wife was gracious enough. She had seen, my performance as an executive.
Yeah, you were, I think at the time, and correct me if I'm wrong, easily one of the most highly rated stockbrokers at the time. You had this reputation, like if you want to sweat the market with some intelligence, speak to Nigel. Is that right?
Yeah. Essentially what we did as a very unique effort was we had a television program called Making Money Make Sense, which really became the flagship, marketing tool where we were educating the black man to look at financial markets as opposed to just having a passive savings account. So we encourage savings and investments, and particularly on the stock market. And then, of course, the money market itself with the investments in treasury bills and the likes. And so because, we were saying making money make sense. Mari hairare, money never sleeps. Imali hailali, it just attracted a huge following. And little did I know, I thought it was perhaps a, public relations exercise that we were embarking on to build a brand. But I had no idea how much power there was in that brand building effort, which we probably did for 2 years before we realized how powerful it was. Old Mutual did demutualization, and all of a sudden, over 50,000 black people had a share certificate, and they didn't know what to do with it because they were traditionally policy holders, and the policy holders were given a portion of the Old Mutual listed shares.
Give us a sense of when we're talking here, just to sort of locate this for us.
This is probably 1998, if my memory serves me right. We started off our banking group 1995, and so we got our license. We launched November 94. We got our license July 95, and then in about 1997, 98 was when Old Mutual was delisted. Or was listed rather. And so only then, 2 years after I had launched the program on TV called Making Money Make Sense, I had a newspaper article I was doing in the Financial Gazette. And only then, because the moment Old Mutual shares arrived into the hands of this 50-odd thousand people, we had 30,000 people, standing outside the doors of our stockbroking firm. And they were saying, what do we do with these shares? You the guys that talk, about the share market. So, almost overnight, we became an asset manager. And our stockbroking firm became the largest retail broker, in Zimbabwe. And so that then pushed us to then lead people to diversify their portfolios by then creating Kingdom unit trusts. And so again, unit trusts were not known, or mutual funds as they're known elsewhere. And so again, we had to go through an education exercise to say you cannot have all your eggs in one basket in this one share. So obviously, Old Mutual is a bellwether stock, but it would pay you to diversify. And then the next phase of our growth was then a series of privatizations, which the government of Zimbabwe did. And lo and behold, with the Cotton Company, the Rainbow Tourism Group now as it's known, Dairy Board and the likes, all were listed. And of course they had to approach us in a sense as the largest stockbroking company on the retail side. And that really drew a lot of companies to us and generated a new business. So originally we had began in the fixed income securities market. That's where we cut our teeth as a discount house, trading fixed income securities, and then of course the share market. And then naturally with organic growth we became advisors to listed companies for rights issues and then also for new listings.
Did you launch initially with a universal financial services license, or did you iterate into the one-stop shop you guys eventually became?
Well, we started strictly as a discount house. In fact, the interesting bit is that was the intention. But it is a bit of a bureaucratic process to get a banking license. And it took us no less than 6 months to get it at the time. And so while we launched with that business in mind, the founding partners included a stockbroker. And so our stockbroking business was in fact then the first to be officially licensed. And so we began officially as a stockbroking company. But we traded fixed income securities, in a sense under that license before consolidating into the discount house.
So I'm going to want us to pick things up in terms of your personal business history and also just anecdotes from your experience as a businessman. But I want to, go back to how you spoke about things I didn't know about your family being in business, you being a second generation entrepreneur. It's something I find refreshing in speaking to you off mic just before we started this interview, and even just the other day as well. You project a refreshing candor around framing the role of privilege in your sort of origin story. And even when you speak about, we've chatted about your children and your current business interests and so on and so forth, you don't seem to be carrying a complex around acknowledging what contributed to your success and perhaps what might pose as limiting factors to other people who are looking to emulate what you've created with your career and your life and your investments. So speak to me a little bit about that, perhaps even starting with things as basic as how different your story would have been had you been born to a family that wasn't entrepreneurial in the Zimbabwe you were born to, or had you not attended some of the prestigious schools you attended in coming up, had your family not been, and when I say your family, I mean you and your wife, had you not had family assets sufficient to launch something like Kingdom. Help people sort of appreciate what some take for granted around the role of privilege in this whole story.
Well, Andile, you ask an interesting question, but the reality of it is I had brothers, I had cousins that also shared the same privileges, as it were, but perhaps didn't seize the opportunities as I did. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that privileged upbringing, which I'm grateful for, would have given me the unfair advantage as such. Simply because when I look around me, there's a handful of business, call them business tycoons or business people that have emerged from our family. We come from a big family. So clearly it's taking advantage of the opportunities as they present themselves. The reality, though, one cannot deny, is a person can't go further than they've been exposed. So I was fortunate in getting a lot of exposure of what life could be if I ventured, along the entrepreneurial lines, as opposed to perhaps, focusing on a profession, which was the tradition. That's how our generation grew up. You go to school to get a training so that you get a job. Whereas, my observations as a young person was looking around me at a funeral My mom was a state-registered nurse. My dad was a businessman. Who got at a family function, who got the status? My uncles were teachers. They were headmasters. I come from a good stock, as indicated. My uncle was a permanent secretary. A nephew was the ambassador to the United Kingdom. And so you watch, but the leverage and power and respect from the community, in my observation, was to those who were businessmen. They waited for them at a funeral. They, kind of determined what happened to the surviving spouse and the kids. They came with a big car, and that had an impression, for me. And so even in my neighborhood, and this is not to say that I had a silver spoon per se. I grew up in Highfields. Now, when I look around and...
which is a township, of course, a township of Harare.
Equivalent to your Soweto. If you look at Highfields, the guys that still emerged, and bless his heart, Oliver Mtukudzi, for example, grew up 2 kilometers from where I lived. But Oliver, being 14 years our senior, chose music as a profession. And we watched Oliver then carve out an entrepreneurial streak with his music, and he became a different musician. And that always fascinated me because he drew crowds to Gwanzura Stadium and people paid to see and hear this guy play. And so in me, I think my eyes, were always saying, where's the money? Where's the opportunity? And it is that training which I think we've got to inculcate and make now part of the syllabus of, the teaching that we do at school, so that people can have an outlook to create value, to create something. And then, or to become a professional and a good one at that. Because even then, I started by becoming an economist and then a banker and wanting to distinguish myself as such, and then wanting to turn that profession into a business. And so I would look around Africa. I see the opportunities in Africa still, that we can carve out and make Africa a better place if we have our eyes that are wide open and we are sensitive to opportunities of adding value and creating things out of nothing.
See, this is what I like, the balanced nuance that you're presenting, because the other extreme, I think that is quite prevalent in many African states, in many emerging parts of the world, is confusing the sort of determination, the discipline required to actually succeed commercially in any field with leveraging of privilege or political power or things of that nature. And I think that tends to be an oversimplification when I sometimes even hear your name discussed in private conversation. What oversimplification have you encountered? I don't know that people would say it to your face perhaps, but what oversimplification do you sense about your origin story in the marketplace, or perhaps that you encounter as you continue to assert yourself as a businessman?
Obviously, people would say, well, he got favors. I think that's a common cliche. He, got favors. But this is pure, solid hard work. You don't save and build a home and buy a home and then sell it. Those...
What if you're a Zimbabwean? I mean, you don't roll like that.
Exactly. So I think that's the point. So it's an oversimplification in the sense that they think that, your name has carried you through. And of course, it takes a lot to build a name. And a name is worth more than silver and gold. A good reputation is worth, more than silver and gold. So from that perspective, I think the added advantage that I see now, clearly, as my wife often says, is, well, pick up the phone and just tell people who you are. Or, shake hands and introduce yourself, because your name then means a lot.
But you've invested.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the point that people need to understand, that it takes a lot of guile to actually invest in a name and through thick and thin be able to hold up your name. And your name can actually then open doors for you and your colleagues. And that name I've used to Zimbabwe's advantage in the region. I've used that name on global stages at the World Economic Forum because I can pick up the phone and call Professor Schwab and be able to get him to return my call. So I think from that perspective, it's something that I would urge my fellow Africans, to maintain a good name, a good credit history, a good reputation through thick and thin.
There's an anecdote you shared yesterday about the early days of Zimbabwe's entrepreneurial boom, certainly when you consider black participation. I'm thinking of your emergence, some of the banks you mentioned earlier on, the early days of Econet, for example, the induction of mobile telephony. And there's an interesting anecdote you shared yesterday that I'd like you to share now about the founder of the Econet group, a certain Strive Masiwa, and perhaps a lesser known aspect of your relationship with him and your participation in what is essentially, arguably, Zimbabwe's biggest listed company success story.
Well, it's an interesting one because we went to school with Tsitsi Masiwa, Strive's wife. So I didn't know Strive from a bar of soap, and we were introduced by Tsitsi to Strive. And he was going to start this, mobile telephone company. And I mean, he was speaking very ambitiously about having a telephone in each individual Zimbabwean's hands. And I kind of looked at this engineer and thought, what's he been smoking? That's probably not legal. How conceivable is that?
And I mean, maybe for people who aren't familiar with the environment, I mean, we're talking about a Zimbabwe at the time where not even every home had a landline, never mind the thought of a future with everyone having something in their hands. I mean, you wait 2, sometimes 3 months just to get a connection to your home. And it was like costly exercise. It was a status symbol in itself. And here's a guy saying you're going to put phones in everyone's hands.
So it sounded preposterous, I mean, for lack of a better word. But he was focused. He was a clear thinker. And he was passionate. And soon enough, after a couple of meetings, I bought into this story. I empathized with, the challenges that he was going through. I had already set up my little bank at the time. And so I, out of a brotherhood, a Christian brotherhood, then became a very, close friend to him.
You're being modest. You were bawling at the time, and you were like, this is my CSR.
Yeah, so I, did some corporate social responsibility, some Christian brotherhood, and lent him a couple of $100,000 for legal fees, at certain critical moments. And as they say, the rest is history. And eventually, because I didn't have adequate faith in this story, I said to him, I think it must have added up to about $2 million at the time. And I said to him at the time of listing, so he retained us also as a stockbroker for their listing. And I said to him at the time, I want my money back as soon as you list your company. And I think they were raising some 60 odd million. So I said, Strive, remember, I want my money back. Mine is a loan. So he tried to persuade me to convert my loan into equity. And I said, no ways. It's
like the brilliant banker you are.
Yeah, I said, my $2 million can make a whole lot more money, in the money market than putting it into like a 20-year vision.
What year is this again?
This is 1998. And Strive, true to his word, repaid me the loan. Strive then appointed me to chair the Finance and Audit Committee, and which I did for 10 years. And he graciously then, for all the assistance that I had offered him, gave me, 2.5% of equity in this founding company.
Goodness me.
And I mean, we bumbled along, as it were. It was difficult. Over the 10 years that I was there, it was, blood, sweat, and tears. It was not easy to grow that firm. And I look now, it's one of the lousiest investment decisions I ever made, I guess.
Would you call it the biggest investment mistake you've ever made?
Probably, and done so casually. I sold the shares. I sold 2.5% of the shares in the course of time, and whereas I could have left that as a portfolio investment. So, in that sense, but that money was put to good use. I bought assets, I diversified my portfolio further, but, it's difficult, of course, to match the return on investment that 2.5% would have meant, had I left that value in that firm today.
What are we calling the value cap today? Somewhere, is it 9 billion?
Absolutely. Now, work out 2.5% of that.
A bit of a headache I'm getting, a little cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, but those are, as an investor, you invest and you don't cry over spilt milk. You move on.
Can we use this as perhaps maybe a springboard for exploring